I'm Rebecca Kemp Brent. Finishing seams wasn't the first thing that I learned when I was learning to sew, but believe me, you only make one garment that you lose to raveled seams before you realize how important an edge finish is, not only for appearance, but for durability as well. I'd like to talk to you about a variety of different ways to finish seams. I think there are almost as many edge finishes as there are fabrics, so you may know of others that I'm not mentioning today, but this will give you a sort of beginning class, a little overview. The easiest way to finish a seam is not to finish it at all, and for some fabrics, such as the felt that I've used in this sort of poodle skirt, cats instead of poodles. With things like a felt fabric, there's no fraying, so you don't have to put any edge finish on it at all. But I do like to press the seam open, and the reason is it's a little less bulky than it would be if I pressed those seam allowances to one side. Another really easy, simple way to finish edges is to use a liquid seam sealant product. And unlike all of these other edge finishes, using a seam sealant is one that you can do before you cut out your pattern pieces, or as soon as you cut them out, but before you actually do the stitching. With any other seam finish, you need to sew the seam first, otherwise you'll probably distort the size of the seam allowances, even if you don't mean to, and it will affect the fit of your garment. So a little bit of seam sealant applied right along the edges of your fabric can be a real lifesaver if you have a fabric that tends to shift. Pinking shears are another great option. They make these zigzagged edges and are very effective at stopping almost all fabrics from fraying. I like to put a line of straight stitching about 1/4 of an inch from the edge before I do my pinking. That helps to prevent knit fabrics from curling, and it just adds a little extra finished appearance to my seam allowances. I think probably the most popular seam finish today is an overcast finish. And if you have a serger, you know exactly how I've sewn this seam. The great thing about a serger is that it allows you to stitch the seam, trim it, and finish the edges all in one pass. So it's an absolutely perfect finish, especially for knit fabrics and simple garments that don't have too many pieces. If you don't have a serger yet, maybe you'll get one someday, you may have a stitch like this one on your sewing machine, which is called an overcasting stitch. And it operates the same way as a serged edge, although you may have to trim your fabric edges before you put the stitch on. You may have to trim the edges manually. I'll show you a little more about that in just a minute when we go to the machine. Another favorite finish of mine is a bound edge, and I love the way that this edge looks on the inside of an unlined jacket. For example, on this sashiko jacket, I wanted to do something a bit like the traditional Japanese jackets, so I had to put my lining and my outer fabric together before I did the embroidery. That means seam allowances are visible on the inside. So I bound the seam allowances and then slip stitched the folded edge of the binding in place, and you have an almost invisible seam. This is practically a reversible jacket. You can also use narrow strips of bias to bind your edges, or you can purchase a product that's specially made for that purpose. I'll show you that one at the machine in just a minute too. The last seam type that I'd like to show you today is called a French seam. And they're most often used for joining very fine fabrics, like this sheer that I've used to make a very simple scarf. You can make a tiny, tiny seam with a French seam, but sometimes they're left a little bit wider, for example, on the inside of a man's dress shirt or even a woman's. You can see that I've used French seams for the side seams of my shirt, which is a great way to add durability because the seam's actually stitched twice. There's a variation of the French seam that's done with a serger, and it's often used in this type of sewing where you're joining lace and fabric together. The tiny seam here is made with the rolled hem settings on a serger. Now let's go to the machine and let me show you a few ways to put these seam finishes together. I'm going to show you first how to make a French seam at the sewing machine, and I'm going to use a standard presser foot, but if your machine has available a straight stitch throat plate and presser foot, you can see that those have just a tiny round hole instead of the more familiar oval hole that allows the needle to move through a zigzag stitch. Using this throat plate and presser foot can help you get fine control when you're making especially tiny seams. I'm going to start then with 2 layers of sheer fabric, and the one thing that's really different about making a French seam is that we start with the wrong sides together. And I'm going to stitch my first seam, and if you have a standard 5/8 of an inch seam, then you make this first pass about a 1/2 an inch from the edge of your fabric. So we're not using the full seam allowance. Then I'm going to take a pair of scissors and I'm going to trim my seam allowance about an 1/8 of an inch away from my seam. The trick to trimming is that the narrower you trim this, the narrower your finished seam will be. But if you trim it too close, then your edges may actually fray out just enough to weaken the seam. So I always suggest that you make a sample first and figure out what's going to be the very best width to use. Now we take this to the iron, and I'm just going to press my seam open. It doesn't really matter which way the seam allowances are pressed. I just want to get them open so that it's a little easier for me when I do the next step, which is to fold my pieces together along the seam I just stitched, and now they are right sides together, just as we normally have it when we're sewing a seam. This stitch goes about an 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge, which means that it's also going to be about an 1/8 of an inch away from that first seam line that I stitched. And this is just another straight stitch seam. And now when we open this up, all of our seam allowances are enclosed, and we have what looks like a beautiful seam on the outside with very little show through because it's so narrow. I left the selvages on this piece of fabric to remind me to tell you something really important. A selvage edge is not a good seam finish. Selvages tend to shrink more than any other part of the fabric, so as tempting as it may be, if you leave the selvage as your seam finish, you may wind up with badly puckered seams. Now let's talk about making a bound seam. There's a particular kind of bound seam that's called a Hong Kong finish, and that's what I'm going to show you today. There are a couple of different ways to do this. One is to start with a matching or contrasting very lightweight fabric, and you cut strips that are about 1 inch to 1.25 inches wide. The other possibility is to use a pre-made product which is just for this purpose and is actually a very fine nylon knit or bias cut tape. If you stretch this product, you'll find that it curls, sort of makes a bend on itself. And you just slip the edge of your fabric inside that little curl, and then you're ready to stitch the binding in place. To make a more traditional Hong Kong finish, and you'll notice that I'm using a print fabric here, I think it would be a lot of fun to make an unlined jacket with the seams finished with the fabric that matches a scarf that we can wear with the jacket. So that's sort of what I have in mind here. I'm using my standard presser foot again, and this time I'm going to adjust it so that the width, it will give me a nice 1/4 inch seam. I've matched up my raw edges with the binding fabric on the right side of my garment fabric and just sewn that at 1/4 of an inch. Take that to the iron and give it a quick press. Then you just wrap the binding around the raw edge of the fabric and stitch in the ditch along the original seam. That finishes the edges, and the little bit of edge that's left showing on the back of the seam allowance, because it's bias cut, won't actually ravel or cause you any problems. The third type of seam that I'd like to show you is the overcast seam. And I'm going to start this one by telling you about a little bit of a problem that you can sometimes have with overcasting. If you take a close look at this seam, you can see that the edge is not very attractive with this seam finish. What's happened is, as I've stitched my stitch, which should be a nice 5mm width, the fabric has curled up on itself. That's called tunneling, and it leaves you with an unattractive edge that's actually a little bit hard. But there is something you can do about that. There's another type of presser foot designed especially for overcasting that has a tiny little metal finger in it. And if I use that presser foot with the overcasting stitch on my machine, that little finger will hold the fabric in place while I stitch and help prevent tunneling. So let's choose one of the overcasting stitches, and we're ready to go. This one is easy as pie. I just sew right along the edge of my fabric. So this will give you several options for finishing the raw edges of your seam allowances. I'd advise you always to finish them somehow, and if you want to make a little contrast or a little fun out of it, then why not? Have fun.